I'm trying to find him. Are you there, Jules? There you are. I need to. Are you on mute? I'm loving all the comments.
That should be better.
Oh, yep. There we are.
Yep.
Right, I'll spotlight you. And I'll go on mute myself. But loving the comments. Keep putting the comments in the chat. And if you've got questions, store them up, because we're going to do a Mentimeter at the end of this and get people asking questions and having a bit of a plenary discussion. But I'll hand over to Jules now. Thanks ever so much for your time and your presentation.
Thanks very much, Matt. And thank you, Louise. That was absolutely lovely. Well done for coming on, speaking to 100 people, I think, 95 participants. And people from all over. It's very nice to see you on, including my old colleague and friend Rachel Bragg, I think is on the list somewhere. So I'm just going to build on what Joseph and Katrina have been talking about to just set the scene slightly wider. Some of this will be territory you know already if you're social prescribing, working in that area already. I'm going to kind of work through and just present the results of some research that we completed and published in the autumn to give a kind of sense of the power of nature-based interventions, which is the sort of language that's often used on these things. So let's just kind of set the scene a little bit. As you heard from Joseph, there's been a lot of research in this area of nature and health. We've done 20 years of research at the University of Essex on evaluating impacts of all sorts of environments on all age groups and social groups, different types of health status starting in different positions with lots of different kinds of activities, not just gardening, but all sorts of other things as well. And there hasn't been a counterfactual. It's not done anybody any harm, let's put it that way. So everything seems to work for everybody. Different things are happening. As we heard again from Louise and Gareth just now, it's not just the nature bit, it's the togetherness of being with other people, it's the learning, it's the kind of self-confidence that comes from all of those sorts of things. But in the kind of general sphere, this research has shown that nature is good for our health. Now, when we started with this was a little bit kind of controversial because there had been some research in the US, very little in the UK, and yet personally, if you asked anybody, what do you think about kind of natural places? How do you feel? Well, we get that kind of mind map that we got on Menti at the beginning. Everyone says, oh yes, of course, you know, it's lovely, I like it. But we hadn't got that kind of hard data to try to affect the way that health systems and policies work. So what do we know then? Well, we know that deliberate interventions, and I'm using a broad-based term here, ecotherapies work. So that's where we kind of design something for a particular group of people and we seek to intervene to help them in some sort of way. So the assumption is that this is with people who are in some way not completely well. That could be argued that covers everybody because we're all not completely well all of the time, maybe more so in the last year. So the idea here is about the impact of deliberately intervening. So there's been a kind of deliberate medicalization of the language. We used a term in a piece of research 10 years ago where we talked about a dose of nature, and that was deliberate, trying to kind of suggest that you could use nature in a kind of medical way. Then came a lot of language around the health services from nature. We now, in the environmental sphere, talk a lot about ecosystem services. What do we get with real economic value from the environment? Flood protection, pollination services, food, biodiversity, and health is now a key part of that. And as I mentioned earlier, the central component really is coalescing around what people call nature-based interventions. And there is an acronym there, they're NBIs, is what a lot of people are calling them. Now that's good, but what is also clear is that implementation is harder. We know these things, you all know these things, and yet the kind of design of our lived environments, inside and outside, often mitigates against it, and it often needs cultural approval for real access to green space. So people might have green space nearby, but not use it because they think they're not allowed to. Lots of examples of that. Or they have other concerns about actually using space in a safe way. So let me just kind of go inside and just hint at the sort of inertia that we already face. Design of space matters. So research has shown, this is from hospitals, that patients in east-facing rooms and in rooms with green views need fewer pain drugs, analgesics, and leave hospitals sooner. They spend on average 2 days less on a ward than people in non-east facing or non-green room views. In other words, the quality of the light, the view, I sit looking out on a kind of green space here as I talk to you, makes a difference to our well-being. So it's not just being in the garden, it's looking at the garden. There's an increasing movement for hospital gardens, which is wonderful, but I've not met a single administrator of a hospital who could put the green space near to the top of their list of priorities, especially at the moment. You've seen it all. It's chaos out there. And it's really hard just to survive. So if we were to start suggesting, well, we need to kind of reorganize around greenery, then it ain't going to work. However, we do know it works because every hospice that I've been in, quite a few, and all the Maggie's centres in Scotland that deal with cancer rehabilitation, all are designed around light, space, nature. There's a picture from a Maggie's centre here around opportunities to meet and talk, to encourage togetherness, and they know that's a central part. And it seems ironic that hospices can do it at the end of life, whereas hospitals can't do it, which would help people live better and live longer. But that's an example of we face institutional inertia to get shifts towards this agenda. And I'm using hospital as a kind of metaphor. I'm not criticizing them, just saying that's how difficult it is to make these changes. This repeats some of what you just heard from Joseph. A lot of research now on the impacts of nature. We know that there is improved mental and physical health from activities in nature. We called this green exercise when we first got going on this research. And we found that the first 15 minutes had the biggest mental health boost. So it's kind of just getting out there and doing something right away. Now, actually, one of the kind of little bits of gold dust from the past year has been how much it is just kind of plainly understood that outdoor activity is good for us during this COVID crisis, and that we need to continue to have that access. This wasn't so normal not that long ago. So that's, I think, kind of quite interesting. Secondly, to point out that we get this kind of big boost of well-being in the first 15 minutes. It's partly from where we've come from. If it's lunchtime after a hard day's work, then we're coming from difficulty and going into kind of quieter, calmer space. Think of those words that we saw in the word map at the beginning. But other things start to happen afterwards. So if you actually want physical health, we've got to work at it for longer. 5 minutes work in the garden is not so good for you physically as 2 hours. And when you've been in the garden 2 hours a day for a long period of time, other things start to happen, like your knowledge increases, you spot things, you hear birds. There was a thrush singing full blast at dawn here where I live this morning, the first one that I've heard this spring. And so you've got to be there to kind of start to hear and see other things in nature. We know that nature improves longevity. A lot of research on this. Walking slows the onset of dementias. Regular walking, and I'm talking about 3 times a week, slows the onset of dementias on average by 10 years. I know this is a big package to say dementia in general. Some are not affected by this, but some are very much influenced. And that's partly because going forward into the landscape encourages memory, and the building up of knowledge about what you're walking into keeps the brain active and pushes back the kinds of things that cause dementias. It's also known that volunteers live 2 years longer. And so that by volunteer, this means people who are kind of giving to others, giving to other people and giving to nature as well. So it gives you a kind of sense of the human construct that's happening in this as well. And lots of these kinds of longitudinal studies, I've just picked one here to show you that other things are important as we think about this, again, as Louise was implying earlier on. A 30-year study of people in Caerphilly and South Wales. I think I saw from the list a number of people from Wales online for this meeting as well. So that's great, welcome. 5 behaviors there that I've listed. If people have 4 of those 5 over a 30-year period, then their likelihood of heart disease is delayed by 12 years, and they live 6 years longer. With 2 of the 5, they only live 2.5 years longer than on average. So you can see that we're talking about kind of multiple things: health, food, not too much consumption of things that are bad for you, physical activity, being outdoors. All of these things kind of add up into a package that's important. We've been doing quite a lot of work recently around what I call the good life. You'll be familiar with the term. You'll have heard of it. It's in kind of common parlance. It was a TV program from the 1970s, but it's also a term that's well understood across many different cultures. Many languages have a term that translates very well into the good life. And we've just surveyed people in 27 different countries with 2,000 different responses about what people said are the things that constitute the good life. And I'm just making the similar point to the previous slide here. This package of things that are important to us: healthy food, togetherness, connected to nature, physical activity, the opportunity for personal growth and learning, and then an ethical or spiritual coherence, a kind of a meaning for life, you could put it that way. And people use different language for this, but that's the kind of broad thing. And then 7th, sustainable consumption, doing stuff that doesn't damage the planet. Now, as it happens, all those top 6 are low carbon. So I'm not going to talk about this here today, but it's an interest. How can we get towards a way of living that saves the planet from the climate crisis, but also improves health and well-being? And it is those 6 to 7 things. Those are the most common things that people come up with in 27 different countries. So if we think of the good life here, that's the things that people mention as most important to them. So let me come to the kind of health component of this then, just to kind of set the scene for the evaluation. Chief Medical Officer of England and Wales in 2013, then again in 2019, talked about the concern at health costs arising from our modern ways of living. Mental ill health, dementias, obesity, and type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, loneliness, with a kind of the core components that concerned her at the time. And the CMO called for what was called a new canon of prevention, saying that health is an asset that needs protecting, and called on ways to slow demands on the NHS. Now, it's kind of interesting because as we look back from here, a year into the crisis with the 3rd lockdown upon us now, this is what it's all been about this last year, about slowing the demand on the NHS, about preventing the pipeline, about keeping people healthy so that we don't then access health service at a rate that is impossible to ensure that people survive from it. So this has had a kind of something of a reasonably decent history, this idea of addressing the pipeline from healthy population down to primary care, secondary care, and how to slow that pipeline. So that in core, it would be going back to what I just said. If we all lived a good life, we'd have a way of reducing the costs on public services quite considerably. It's estimated, this is again from CMO data, 15 million people in England and Wales suffer from LTCs, long-term health conditions. They comprise 50% of GP appointments, 70% of hospital inpatient days. So there's a lot of a kind of repeat need from people to go back to services because they haven't been able to get in a position where they feel permanently in a new state of health. And this ties in with a lot of interest in what are called social models of health. So just a single slide on this, just to make this point, that the structures of social, economic and ecological environments matter. It's not about personal lack of will or moral lack of moral strength that people are ill. It is about the conditions in which they find themselves, the conditions in which we find ourselves. And these influence current health and future longevity very strongly. In the Good Life slide there, I showed some pictures from Japan. Japan has the largest number of centenarians in the world. They do all of those things. Their social, economic and ecological environment allows people, encourages them to keep active, to eat well, to be together, to get out in nature, to engage in personal growth throughout the life course. And that's why many of them live a long time. So we know that green space does these sorts of things, reduces mortality, changes stress, increases the opportunity for physical activity, changes dietary decisions and habits, really important, and affects longevity. And again, I'm going to just focus on a single measure that is now kind of widely used. You saw how Katrina and Joseph talked about a kind of range of different ways of measuring outcomes, but this is the happiness and life satisfaction measure that captures a lot of the complexity that we've talked about here. So let me just say something for some of you working in social prescribing already. This is something you know only too well. So just a very brief summary. Social prescribing, green social prescribing, improving access to psychological therapies, IAPT, and so forth have become very successful across many parts of the country. Many social prescribing operations offering 50 plus options for people, and some more than 200. Bromley by Bow now has about 220 different kind of activities that are offered. And that's the oldest and most sophisticated, I think it's fair to say, unless somebody would like to argue with that, social prescribing operation. But the coverage in the UK is patchy. There are these kind of areas where people have taken it on, invested in it, made a big difference, but places next door have almost not even heard about it. And Matt will know that from our region. There are some CCGs who've got on board with this, some GPs and others who just haven't got the wherewithal to be able to do that yet. It's that institutional inertia that I talked about earlier. And social prescribing clearly needs new infrastructure and what are often called link advisors. I think several people on this meeting are possibly playing that role at the moment. And there appear to be kind of a range of referrals for advice and knowledge, benefits, housing, skills development, activities in social groups, and activities with therapeutic aims. So although we're talking about therapeutic horticulture here, it may be other things that people actually need as a priority. It may be advice on benefits. It may be advice on housing that is of primary concern. And if we set up infrastructure around this thing called social prescribing, particularly with an interest in green social prescribing, if someone comes with a need around benefits or housing, we can't be turning people away and saying, oh, we don't do that. And we don't know where you get that advice. You've got to go to the CAB, which is only open, you know, a day a week or whatever. So thinking about the kind of broader picture, this is filling the space where governments have retreated, I should be saying. You know, there's a whole separate argument that we could be having here. Say, why are we doing this then? Why are we setting up this new infrastructure? Wasn't this something that national and local governments should be doing? Well, there's been a retreat from this kind of support, social support, economic support for people to stay well. That's kind of one of the reasons. We could discuss that another time. So we've done research on NBIs, nature-based interventions. The point being here, if there are economic consequences and costs of not acting, then there must be benefits of acting early and keeping people happy and healthy. So if people are imposing costs on public services and we reduce those costs, we can measure that lack of cost as a benefit and create an economic argument for acting. So the data on NBIs here is from TrustLink's work. You've heard that, a bit about that as well, from the Greenlight Trust, a Suffolk-based woodland therapy organization, from a big project of a multiple activities led by Mind, Eco Minds. Rachel, who was on this meeting, Rachel Bragg was the lead on that, and on some work that we've done on evaluating Tai Chi as a mind and body intervention in green space. So a range of different things there, but trying to do something similar. And we've benchmarked this against the ONS, Office for National Statistics data on life satisfaction and happiness. So we've got national data on this now. It's really important. That gives us a chance to say, well, what's the national average? What are the range? Where does that leave us? So this is the slide of the evaluations, before and after effects on life satisfaction or happiness. Now, some people are a bit kind of unhappy with the term happiness because they think, oh, that's just kind of woolly, isn't it? Well, life satisfaction, well-being, happiness all work together because people intuitively understand what we're talking about here. So I'm going to stay with that. At the top there, the red is the UK national average, about 7.7. It's a scale of 0 to 10. 30% of the population are up at 9 to 10, super happy. 5% of the population are below 5. That is really low life satisfaction, low health status. So that's what those blue ones are at the top there. The 4 NBI and NBI programs with 640 people, the red in the middle, raised life satisfaction and happiness by about 1 point through their activities. This may not look like much, but it's a really big deal. 1 point changes on this scale come from really big things in life. Establishing a new partnership, formalizing it in marriage, having a baby, can result in increases in 1 point. Decreases of 1 point come from bad things, breakups, illness, deaths in the family, and so forth. And you can see the summary there. The 3 therapeutic programs began at different levels. So Trust Links was working with people beginning with a score of about 6 and a bit and adding 1 to their score. And you can see at the bottom there, Matt and colleagues have got data on 1 year of activities and also 2. And the interesting thing is that 2 years increases the impact from 1 to about 1.2 to 1.3. So there's an improvement over time. You can see that the similar sort of thing seems to happen with the Tai Chi activities there for novices, experienced and experts, starting at different points because of what they've already done and then going different distances after that. All these slides are going to be available, and this the paper on which this is written, this is drawn, is open access and it can be downloaded and read by anybody. So the average of all projects is +1. The woodland and horticulture therapies, 1 to 1.3 to 1.4. That's really interesting. For those who benefited, this is actually higher, 1.6 to 1.9, because something like 20% of people don't complete programs or don't see any benefit. So if you segment the data, not everybody is benefiting. Some people are hitting particular difficulties, things happen in life, stuff comes along, and people don't complete stuff. And at the end of the course, they're actually worse off than when they started. So I want to come back to that 20% in a moment, because we can't assume that everybody is benefiting from the activity all the time. It's just accidental things that happen to us. We have seen evidence that improvements increase over time. And we've also seen that people who start low, who are already in a worse position, well worse than the national average of 7.7, the red dot I showed before, they are able to travel further. So there's a strong equality message here, which is the inequalities in society that exist can be partly offset by working with people starting low and using these kinds of therapeutic horticulture programs. So as I said, it's very hard to get these increases of +1 and sustain them in life events. Very often we can get a spike and then it drifts back down over time. Up spike and drifts back down towards a kind of a natural average for us. So the key is getting them up and then keeping it high over time. Second part, and I'm coming towards the end here, Matt, just to give you the time on this. We also measured the costs saved, the impact on the use of public services. And this was data from only one of these MBIs, data that we had on GP visits and appointments, A&E visits, and police incidents, interactions with the police service. People who work in mental health will know that the police are frontline mental health workers now. They're not necessarily trained for it, another discussion point, but they are frontline when it comes to dealing with people suffering from real difficulties when it comes to mental health. We used, and again, you can look at the data if you want, the Treasury Green Book and the Manchester New Economy standard data and methods on how to measure costs over 1 and 10 years. And we measured the impacts on reduced public costs, public service costs, reduced loneliness, and on increases in life satisfaction and health. And I've just summarized quite a complicated picture down here into these are the benefits created. It says costs prevented, but that's the same thing. That's how economists work. In 1 year, the cost prevented by reduced public health and public service use, £830 per person. Over 10 years, that works out as a present benefit of over £6,000. So if you were to go as a supplier of these services and say, I want to spend this amount of money on one person undertaking this program, by 10 years, that person will have created £6,000 worth of public benefits by going on that program. Now, it costs a lot less to provide a service for one person than that. So as I say at the bottom here, there are substantially high benefit to cost ratios in all of these areas. We can save large amounts of public money by undertaking these sorts of nature-based interventions. And this is an example of how we can do that through changed public health and public service use, reducing the costs of loneliness, and creating benefits, health benefits of increased life satisfaction and happiness. And this is done through income equivalents. And that's the kind of larger number that you can see there in 1 year. But over 10 years, because you get this immediate benefit, the 10-year benefit is less than the 1 year. So the key challenges then for all of this are threefold, I think. Turning interventions into habits. Habits are really, really difficult to form and really, really difficult to break. We all know that. But many programs don't go on for long enough to allow a kind of hard wiring of habits. And my rule of thumb is about 50 hours of activity is needed to turn an activity that requires large amounts of cognitive effort into something that's automated. The best example would be how long it takes to learn to drive a car, or how long it takes to learn to ride a bike. Those are examples of habits that take lots of cognitive effort. But at the end of it, you get in the car and you just drive without thinking because you've automated all those things. But if you were to be asked to try to forget how to drive a car, that would be really difficult. That's why it's really difficult to change diet, change drink, change unhealthy habits, because they're hardwired into us because we've practiced them for a long time. We need to focus on the negative responders and those who drop out. I think that was something we picked up on the data. Some people are affected badly by events, and they, at the end of courses, they're saying, this hasn't worked for me. So are we doing enough to focus on those and not just those with the great stories? It's clear that offering a range of options is fantastic. So it's not just about nature, it is about food, of course. Therapeutic horticulture is central to that. Togetherness, being with people, nature, physical activity, and there are opportunities for personal growth. Actually, Louise put it very well in all of those areas. I couldn't put it better myself. And the Department of Health and Social Care has said last year, actually before COVID, prevention and early intervention programs represent good value for money. Well, that's precisely what our data shows. It does represent good value for money. So let me finish with two small quotes. Well, one's a quote and one's a small quote. So the Tao Te Ching was written 2,500 years ago. And chapter 33 back then said, the best things in life are not things. And that was just precisely what I showed previously. The things in good life tend not to be stuff and things. They tend to be relationships, interactions with the environment, with other people, opportunities for growth and change. And Mary Oliver, who died 2 years ago, a wonderful American poet, she wrote a lovely short poem called Instructions for Living a Life. 7 words. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. So it's the paying attention in the gardens, being astonished by it, saying, isn't that wonderful? And then telling other people about it. At home, friends, others, that's what actually makes this whole thing work. So I thought that that would be something you might be able to kind of carry with you. And I finished with a slide for my most recent book, was called The East Country. So that deals with some of this kind of immersion and attentiveness, this paying attention to nature that makes a difference for health. And there's a Twitter handle there if you want to kind of go and have a look at some of the stuff that I've been posting about these sorts of things. So thank you, everybody. And I'll hand back to Matt. And I'll stop sharing now, but I think there's going to be a way for you to access all of this if you want in due course. So thanks very much, everybody, for your attention. So stopping sharing and handing over to Matt.